The rhythmic clatter of a cast iron stove door and the scent of pine wood smoke drifting through a freezing bedroom. That was how a normal day began. In a small coastal village in Maine, back in 1949. In that year, over 50,000 American families lived entirely off the sea, roughly the size of the crowd at Fenway Park. Do you remember that sharp shiver as you left the heavy wool blankets to step onto the freezing hardwood floor? This is the story of those mornings, those fishing trips, and a simple life that has slowly faded away. Let the warmth of a strong cup of black coffee lead us back to that winter in Maine. At 5 in the morning, the entire house was still draped in darkness and the biting New England cold. Father woke up first, pulling on his heavy Mackinaw coat and the thick rubber boots that smelled of salt. In the kitchen, Mother was rekindling the fire, the snapping of dry wood, the only music of the dawn. The smell of salt pork frying in a cast iron skillet began to drift, mixing with hand-ground coffee. Houses in Maine then often had low ceilings to trap heat, with small windows that looked toward the sea. Do you remember having to scrape the frozen salt spray off the window pane just to see the world outside? The Zenith radio on the shelf crackled to life, broadcasting the morning weather report for the bay fishermen. Father stepped out the door, his breath turning into thick white clouds in the silent fishing village. Do you remember the crunch of frozen snow crust under heavy boots as you walked down to the docks? The wooden boats were moored close together, a thin layer of ice coating the ropes and the masts. Morning life unfolded quietly, without the roar of engines, only the steady calling of the Atlantic Sea. As the sun began to rise, the harbor became the beating heart of the entire coastal community. In 1949, over 1,000 small docks like this one lined the rugged Maine coastline. The men greeted each other with a silent nod, as careful with words as they were with fuel. The rhythmic thrum of diesel engines began to roar, breaking the heavy silence of the winter dawn. Do you remember the smell of engine oil mixing with the sharp salt spray in the freezing breeze? The boats slowly left the docks, leaving long white wakes on the mirror-still surface of the water. At the one-room schoolhouse on the hill, the children gathered around the black coal stove. Back then, the whole town had just one teacher for every grade, like one large family. Do you remember how your fingers felt stiff with cold as you tried to write your lessons? Meanwhile, at the general store in town, the women were trading the latest news from the neighborhood. The general store didn't just sell sugar and salt. It was the link between families and the world. Imagine this. In 1949, over 60% of a family's food was homegrown or caught. Do you remember the ring of the party line phone? 3 short bursts meant for your house. Those phone chats were how people on distant farms kept in touch during the long winters. The main street of these towns wasn't grand, but it contained your entire world within its blocks. Down at the shipyard at noon, the shipwrights were still hard at work with thick oak planks. The scent of fresh wood shavings mixed with pine resin was the signature of a Maine shipyard. In that year, Maine produced over 3,000 wooden boats, more than the entire modern fleet of Oregon. Do you remember the sight of them steaming long planks of wood to bend them for the hull? A worker's lunch was often just a cold meat sandwich and a crisp apple from the cellar. They sat together on stacks of lumber, sharing quiet stories about the seasons of heavy seas. Life in Maine demanded resilience, where people relied on one another to survive the winter. Afternoon came early, the sun dipping behind the pines when the clock barely struck 4. The children left school, sliding along the icy roads, their laughter echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Do you remember the feeling of sitting on that old wooden sled that once belonged to your grandfather? In the coastal farmhouses, the women began their preparations for the evening family meal. The scent of baking bread began to fill the house, driving away the late afternoon chill. 1949 was a year of simple meals, potato chowder and salted codfish. Imagine this. Every year, a Maine family consumed over 200 pounds of homegrown potatoes. Do you remember the clatter of the milk delivery truck passing through the streets every afternoon? Glass milk bottles with a thick layer of cream on top, sitting neatly on the wooden porch steps. It was these small details that shaped the sense of safety and belonging in your childhood. As darkness fell, the lighthouse on the point began sweeping its rhythmic beams across the bay. The men out at sea looked to that light to find their way back home to their families. Do you remember that eager wait for the sound of Father's heavy footsteps on the porch? Father returned smelling of the salt sea, his hands bright red from the cold in the fish. He hung his damp coat on the peg, leaving a small pool of melted snow on the floor. Fresh codfish were cleaned right in the kitchen, prepared for a late and hearty dinner. The whole family gathered around the large wooden table, lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. No television, no phones, just stories about a long day spent out on the cold Atlantic. After dinner, Father often sat by the stove, slowly lighting a pipe filled with woody tobacco. The scent of pipe tobacco, mixed with aged pine, created an atmosphere of strange and deep peace. Do you remember the steady tick-tock of the pendulum clock sitting on the fireplace mantel? Evening hours passed slowly, like the very breath of Maine during the long winter months. Mother sat in her armchair, her hands moving quickly as she knitted wool socks for the new season. These handmade items carried the warmth and the love of the woman of the house. Do you remember curling up under heavy quilts, listening to the wind howl through the eaves? Deep sleep came after a long day of hard work, wrapped in the safety of family. Maine in 1949 wasn't rich in things, but it was overflowing with quiet peace. It was a time when people truly knew the value of a warm roof and a full belly. What has disappeared forever is that unhurried pace of life, where every minute truly mattered. Do you remember waking up the next morning to find the snow drifted all the way up to the windows? A world of pure white emerged, waiting for the hands of labor to begin the day anew. The numbers from 1949 have now become distant echoes in the halls of memory. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear the waves and smell the pine wood smoke. Maine is still there, with its resilient lighthouses and the stories of a time long since past. The generations who grew up by the sea then are now the ones telling these memories to their children. The memory of a winter morning in 1949 isn't just about the freezing cold. It is about the warmth of humanity, of community, and a life filled with purpose and meaning. The smell of pine wood smoke, the clatter of the stove door, those things may have faded away, but in your heart, the winter of 1949 still burns with a warm and steady flame. Do you remember the thump-thump of the fishing boat's engine as it prepared to leave the dock? That was the sound of hope, signaling a hard day of labor that held its own promise. In Maine that year, the sea wasn't just a workplace. It was the very breath of the land. In 1949, over 40,000 tons of cod were harvested from these very coastal waters. That amount of fish was enough to feed the entire population of New York City back then. Do you remember how your hands felt numb as you untangled frozen nets in the ocean wind? Those heavy tasks forged the iron will of the people living throughout the New England region. At the processing sheds along the harbor, the women also began their long work shifts for the day. The smell of fresh fish and strong brine was the unmistakable scent of a fishing village. Do you remember the ship's horn echoing to signal the lunch break under Maine's gray winter sky? Life flowed on, repeating the eternal cycles of the tides and the changing seasons of the year. In that year, over 80% of the men in this area were third-generation fishermen. They didn't learn their trade from books, but from facing the storms out on the open sea. Do you remember the strange and deep peace when a storm passed and the sea grew still again? The winter days in Maine, back in 1949, always ended with the deep warmth of family. Mother used to tell stories of the old days when the lighthouse still used kerosene for its light. The world has changed so much, but the values of loyalty and hard work have remained behind. Do you remember the soft crackle of the old record player in the living room on Sunday nights? Those were the melodies that connected generations, softening the hardships of a life spent at sea. In that year, over 5 million vinyl records were sold across all the eastern states. That amount was enough to line a path all the way from Maine down to distant Florida. Do you remember the feeling of holding the local newspaper, still smelling of fresh printer's ink? News about the fishing village, the catch of the season, and the neighbors you saw every day. Life was hard, but people always knew how to cherish exactly what they had in their hands. 1949 has long since passed, but its spirit still lives on within each of us today. What remains are the stone markers and the wooden houses weathered gray by the passing years. They stand as silent witnesses to a golden era of the American fishing industry. Your generation is among the last to carry the vivid memories of that old Maine within you. Why are small memories, like the smell of coffee or the crunch of snow, so incredibly important? Because they are the threads that bind us to our roots and to those who came before us. Do you remember the feeling of hugging Father when he returned, his coat still freezing cold to the touch? Those moments cannot be bought with money. They can only be kept safe within the heart. Let these memories warm your soul during the winter days of your own life's journey. Maine in 1949 is always there, in every breath and every beat of your heart. The rhythmic clatter of a cast iron stove door, the scent of pine wood smoke in a cold room. Those things may not be found in most of our modern neighborhoods anymore, but they remain. But if you close your eyes long enough, you can still hear it and feel it all again.